So, so thank you very much to staying with us. Thank you, Sasha. Thank you, Beny, for being here with us this afternoon, tonight. We will have some closing remarks at the end of this session, but anyway, I would like to remind that in this conference, we were thinking about the motion as something that is somewhere between materiality and immateriality, body and soul, mind, and the impact of digital and the technologies of modernity in our relation to the world. And for that, we wanted to invite some artists or a group of artists who could talk not only about how they relate to technology or how they use technology, but who could reflect and problematize the relationship between technology and human life and the relationship with the real. So, and Sasha and Beny, in their work, they go all the way to the past, to an early or a prehistory of modern science, I could say, and the difficulty that it is for us as humans to grasp and operate in the world. Sasha and Beny, Sasha Litvintseva and Beny Wagner, they are artists, filmmakers, researchers, and writers. They've been working together since 2017, focusing in moving images as a tool for active production of new worlds. They are driven by the thresholds between the body and its surroundings, knowledge regimes and their relation to power, and modes of organization and perception of the world. Their work has been shown in a series of venues such as the Berlinale, Courtisan Festival, Rotterdam, Cinema do Réel, Haus der Kultur der Welt, ICA in London, Sonic Acts, Video Brazil, and the Biennials of Venice, both art and architecture. For a very brief introduction to Sasha and Beny, Sasha has a PhD in Goldsmiths, and she lectures film theory and practice in the Queen Mary University. Beny is a PhD candidate in Winchester School of Art. He has been a researcher in Jan van Eyck Academy, and he has lectured in the Netherlands and the UK. For this presentation, with the title Monsters, Measures and Movements, they will show us, they will discuss with us how their practice-based research with the focus on two films, a demonstration from 2020 and Constant, an upcoming film for 2022, in the way that moving image and science have been used as tools to measure life forms. And their interest is to cross-pollinate these two fields, science and cinema, to subvert the quantitative functions of the two systems. So, with no further delay, thank you very much, Sasha and Beny, and the stage is yours.
Thanks very much, Pedro, and thanks very much to all the other organizers for putting on this excellent event and for being so hospitable to us.
Yeah, thanks so much. It's been really a pleasure to be here. And yeah, thanks to everyone for staying.
So yes, in this presentation, we're going to, for the first time, talk about two of our major projects alongside each other that we made in the last 2 or 3 years, but we've been working together across a number of different media, including writing and speaking, for a number of years before that. And a key point to make in relation to both these projects and how to intake us presenting about them is that with both of them, you'll see that we start with something that we know almost nothing about, but somehow sparks our curiosity. And the films themselves are actually just a trail we leave behind in the process of our learning about something, but also in the process of trying to find some kind of visual forms for often quite abstract concepts. And through that, kind of really engaging with what the medium of moving image can do.
Yeah, I would add to that maybe that we try to find, I guess, in trying to kind of find forms for the type of research that we are doing, we're often kind of thinking kind of specifically about what types of information can be transmitted in moving image, and what kinds of communication are possible within that. And so, in a sense, I think we always have at the forefront considerations about kind of what the medium is, what it can and can't do, to think in a way about the types of worlds that are possible to build within a moving image practice. And and I think we have a lot of varied interests and concerns, and we're partially driven by historical and theoretical research and questions, but then also very committed to movement, rhythm, form, things that are the kind of very physical things that moving image is so good at doing. And oftentimes those things seem to be incompatible, kind of like an intellectual pursuit and kind of a very physical experience, but we kind of try to bring those two things together in different ways. And I guess each project that kind of creates its own terms, and we try to kind of approach each project without preconceptions of what it should look like, and so or what kind of story we're going to tell about the subject matter that we're interested in. And so you'll see that, I guess, in the two projects that we're showing, they manifest different questions with very different means. Yeah.
So first, we're going to speak about the background research and the process of making our film A Demonstration from a couple of years ago. The spark for the film came when Beny came across in reading a text about something else, just this very enigmatic phrasing in just a single sentence that alluded to taxonomies of monsters produced by the early naturalist Elisa Aldravanti. And we became very fixated on what appeared as an oxymoron, taxonomy of monsters. And it really made us question what taxonomies meant at that early point when they were becoming such a prevalent structuring principle in a way that early modern European pre-science, technically speaking, was beginning to try to methodically explore the natural world. And so through this kind of spark, we started researching that historical moment and that historical moment in the development of what was to become science as we know it in the West. And finding that even though what appeared to us as an oxymoron in that particular object of the taxonomy of monsters had many kind of clear explanations, but that moment itself, and as we later come to understand, every moment in perceptual paradigm is structured on a contradiction necessarily. And some of the key contradictions of that moment that became our kind of driving structural principle for the way that we approached the film as well was that on the one hand, it was a moment when it was beginning to really be committed to dissecting separate entities from each other as opposed to understanding ecosystems as just being in flux. And so removing entities from their natural environment and naming them as separate things. And also at the same time, and sometimes by the same people, systematically dissecting the human body and also severing one from the other. But at the same time as this, there was also a now unimaginable to us fluidity between human, non-human, animal, vegetable, and mineral, and visual analogy was a massive way that they used as a way of knowledge production.
it's maybe worth giving a little background on maybe the main naturalist whose work we were looking at, whose name is Ulisse Aldrovandi. He died in 1605, I think, and in the second part of the 16th century, he was maybe one of the most prominent naturalists in Italy, in northern Italy, and he had one of the largest collections of specimens at the time. I think there were 18,000 specimens, and this was a subject of boasting. And one of the things that he's well known for his, I guess, historically now, because in a lot of ways most of his work was discredited almost immediately after his death. About half a century after his death, there was a very active drive to kind of erase his contributions to natural science. But one of the enduring things, and what this illustration is from, is the Monstrorum Historia, which was published posthumously and was a taxonomy of about 120, I think, different monsters that are classified in the same way. So it's one of 11 volumes, I think, 11 volumes that include birds and snakes and flowers and monsters. And there's one volume on monsters. And so, you know, that, of course, from our perspective, seems very unscientific. And so, you know, immediately our question was kind of, what is the knowledge regime that's so different from ours that allows these things to coexist? And then it's maybe worth just saying, kind of the word monster derives from the Latin monstrare, which means to show, to reveal, to demonstrate. And so the monster is connected to perception, to looking, to revealing, yeah. So again, I guess another thing is that what enabled Aldrovandi's life work, and especially the Monstrorum Historia, to become so prominent in the early modern imagination was that it used the printing press, which was a relatively new technology. So there's a very, you know, we were kind of quite interested in thinking about what the relationship is between the monstrous, whatever that may be, something that's shifting constantly in our perception. Every cultural moment has its own monsters, and a relationship to visual culture, but especially to media technology. So what's the relationship between are monsters inherently products of mediation and media technologies? And we write about that in a text. We actually have we published a book in conjunction with a show that we had earlier this year, and we wrote an essay for it, and we kind of talk about we especially kind of like elaborate on that idea of like monsters as mediation.
But just to say another detail about monsters in relation to the printing press, just to paint a picture, that monsters in the medieval and early modern imaginations were mostly understood as exaggerations of monstrous births, so some kind of deformities, and these were seen as portents, as in warnings from God, and therefore needed to be interpreted. Therefore, monster is something that shows something. And before the printing press, you know, if something like that happened in a particular village or town, that village or town would know about it. In some circumstances, maybe a painting would be made that might travel to another town, but their spread was fairly limited. But with the printing press, drawings of such monsters often, you know, widely exaggerated and fictionalized, and kind of containing very specific kind of religious symbols that one would be supposed to decode as the specifics of the warning. These would be printed in large quantities and circulated widely in the surrounding area. And the fact that they would reach further meant that in any one place, these things would be coming from various directions. And so there was this general sense that people were living in particularly apocalyptic times, but these warnings were being issued by the printing press, not by high powers.
Is this a monster?
No, mostra. Questo, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. È un gallo.
Sì,
Guarda questo, mostro.
Sì.
Questo, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. Capo, questo, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. Eccoli, tutti mostruosi. Sì, fino a... Questo no, o sì. Che bestia. Questo no, dopo.
No.
Neanche questo, quindi fino
Where
a...
do we want to start?
So, I'll kind of try to go like a bit faster, our first concern was kind of like, what do we actually film? You know, when we kind of became very interested about this, it was like, well, what do we actually film? Where, like, how do we? We were reading and learning about this thing, and it felt so loaded to us. Like, it felt like a very kind of like a very direct experience, and we didn't want to go and kind of just film some things at a historical distance. You know, we wanted to kind of reproduce the experience that we were having and engaging with this material. Is there something weird with the mic? No. But we did go to several places that were the kind of that were connected to this early modern history in Europe, in Italy, especially in Bologna, and we were interested in seeing this Monstrum Historia, and we got in touch with the Biblioteca Universitaria in Bologna. It's one of the first European universities, or maybe the first European university, and they were incredibly gracious, and they said, yes, you can come and film this prized artifact. And we arrived, and they had set up this table for us with these 3 volumes, and were really friendly and really accommodating. And then we kind of came in, and we said, you know, we saw what they had put out, and we saw one of birds, and we saw one of snakes. I think there's one of birds and snakes, and then but not the Monstrum Historia. And so we said, you know, and the director was in a very kind of kind way, was like, no, we couldn't take that out. It's in the vault. It's our most prized artifact, you know, so we thought we'd show you these instead. And, you know, of course, we were like a bit disappointed, and the librarians there registered our disappointment. And the thing with Aldrovandi was that he was fascinated in kind of what we today would call like a morphological morphological like aberration from biological forms. So, you know, all of his classifications were kind of, you know, in the birds he has many birds with 5 legs, or just any kind of like anomalous kind of bird. And the librarians realized that we were there for the Monstrum Historia, so she was kind of flipping through these pages and kept being like, here's a monster, here's a monster, here's a monster. And at that moment, as we were watching this kind of performance that was kind of, you know, there to make up for what was, I guess, a misunderstanding, that act in itself was kind of such an interesting way for us to engage with what is retained historically. How do certain standards and certain forms of knowledge get passed on literally in someone's nervous system? So 500 years after this naturalist, after the work has been completely discredited and considered unscientific, the woman who's there knows intuitively how to define some kind of something that's perceived as normal, something that's perceived as the standard, and something that is an aberration from the standard, and kind of delivers that to us as this kind of act of generosity. And so, yeah, so this was a short kind of clip from the film.
This is one of the sequences from the film, and the reason that we chose it was kind of to demonstrate a lot of different approaches to cinematography and image making that we were exploring around the kind of conceptual themes of the film. And so on the one hand, there was a question of what are we going to film? And as Benny was just saying, the story of the librarians, once we localized a few particular environments in which we should go, things started happening in the present. But we also always, with our work, want to develop modes of image making or modes of using the camera that are somehow directly in response to the subject matter as well. And in the sequence, we were kind of experimenting with juxtaposing a number of different ways of thinking about cuts in a cinematic sense, but also in the conceptual senses of cutting apart the body, for example. One of the locations, as you would have seen, is an anatomical theater, possibly the first anatomical theater in Europe as well, this location. And unlike the sequence in the club, where it's on the one hand the light and on the other hand our editing that creates the ruptures in space and time, here is just the architecture itself that generates a similar kind of flicker effect, architecture together with the way that we're moving. And then immediately after this, there's a sequence where we're panning across a shelf in a museum, and this museum had many, many rooms of these incredible specimens from that time period, and we spent a whole day filming there. And in the end, the thing that spoke to us the most, and the only thing that we used in the film, was footage of this one shelf that had a faulty light, and that somehow generates this feeling that was also present in these other sequences. And in all of them, it's somehow mixed between the circumstantial element of a particular environment, in most cases also just at that particular moment, together with the way that we're kind of choosing to film it somewhat intuitively in relation to how that moment is unfolding in terms of light, in terms of various factors. And then later in the editing, kind of finding all these affinities between different kinds of material.
Yeah, I guess, you know, in our research, you know, it was what the kind of one of the responses to our question, like what is the world in which a taxonomy of monsters is possible, is a world that is based on a very different set of terms for making meaning about what elements of the natural world and the human's position within the natural world. And one of the things that really struck us from, I guess we were, one of the books we were reading was Paula Finland's Possessing Nature, and she talks a lot about how the kind of role of visual analogy in scientific knowledge production in early modernity, and how there was a sense that kind of I mean, it's still a religious paradigm, of course, that God had left these clues in the natural world, and that the enlightened observer had a particular power to kind of decode things in the landscape. And so, you know, you get these kind of things that seem, you know, amusing from our perspective, which is kind of, you know, thinking about bark on a tree, like bark on a tree to be like skin to a bone, or the way that because the walnut looks like a brain, it would heal illnesses of the brain if it was ingested and stuff like that. So that was a really interesting way for us to think. So kind of this visual analogy as a form of finding truth and as a form of meaning making, which is of course kind of one of the more powerful tools of cinema in montage. We construct meaning by putting often completely unrelated things next to each other, and so, you know, yeah. So that was kind of something that was really at the forefront of our thinking, and because we did work in quite an intuitive way when we were filming and when we were going to these locations, and you know, really insisted on not having kind of a predetermined structure. So when after the 2-week filming period, we had a huge amount of footage that we had accumulated, and our first task was kind of to figure out what to do with it, and we made these grids. I guess they're kind of like storyboards, but they're not. There's no like linearity to them. We just looked for things that were pleasing to us, and you know, in a way, we were kind of inhabiting that paradigm, not as a form of truth making, but as a form of inhabiting a different reality. Yeah, and so we kind of played with these. Yeah, they kind of basically kind of built the film up in modules in a way. It kind of developed organically from these units, and then kind of built its way into the final sequence. And I think we have quite a lot more, I guess, to say about this film, but I think because we also want to talk about the second project, I think we'll go just straight to the second project.
Yeah, we'll pivot and then we can come back to things if that's interesting.
I guess there's, yeah, so if you have questions about that, keep that in mind. But yeah, so this is also like an interesting thing for us to talk about now. It's actually the first time that we're talking about this film in public, because it actually hasn't premiered yet. I guess, yeah, we just finished it, and at some point after demonstration, I guess we kind of, conversations developed organically around the history of measurement. We just kind of became interested in that, and measurement has an inevitable relationship to monstrosity as well. The monster doesn't exist without measurement, and the measurement doesn't really exist without monsters. They're set in relation to each other, because, I mean, I think maybe we didn't kind of articulate it that much, but the taxonomizing of monsters, which is very specific to this early modern period, was really in an effort to produce standards, to produce norms, and the very beginnings of a kind of pathologization of anything that deviated from that. It's more complicated in the early modern period, so there's like a lot of nuance in that, and I don't want to kind of take away any of that nuance, but basically just to kind of point out that there's an inevitable relationship to measurement, and you know, we knew very little about measurement at the time, and but I guess one of our first questions was kind of a pretty common knowledge that measurements used to be derived from the human body. They're not derived from the human body anymore. What happened? What was the process by which we abstracted measurements from the human body and made them kind of into universal units? And one of the first things that we encountered was, I think it was via Jason Moore. He's like a Marxist ecologist, and he referenced a book by a Polish historian called Witold Kula, and he was an economic historian, and he had written several books on the history of economics from a kind of Marxist perspective in the second half of the 20th century. And I guess from something we read, he just had this, like, as he was writing these books about economics, kept coming to the problems of metrology and the history of metrology, and had been kind of over several decades developing, kind of putting research to the side. And we looked into that book. Generally, if you read the vast majority of histories of metrology will present a very teleological narrative about the history of measurement, which is basically kind of like a linear path to being more accurate. And really, I mean, the textbooks they're incredibly kind of narrow in that way. And what was so appealing to us about a very different kind of history that Witold Kula was presenting was kind of well, did you want to? Did I say that? Well, basically, I mean, I guess he has a historical materialist perspective on measurement, and understanding that measurement is ultimately tied to property, and it's ultimately tied to power structures, and that it's determined by those power structures, and that it's anything but obvious. And so most of his research was about like medieval and early modern Eastern Europe, and then about the French Revolution and the metric revolution, and yeah. This is a short clip from the film.
A first-century Jewish historian, Flavius Josephus, was once asked who he thought had invented measures. "It was none other than Cain," he responded. After killing his brother Abel, the wicked son of Adam and Eve went on to commit many other sins. He was the author of weights and measures, a system that transformed a world of noble simplicity into one forever filled with judgment and dishonesty. The fear that measurement could be used to cheat resurfaced throughout early modern Europe as land became increasingly privatized and people dispossessed. This fear was expressed in superstitions about measurement. People did not need to understand how measurement systems worked to fear the ways they remade the world. In detaching space from time, body from environment, measurement could disfigure, pervert, deform. It could stop the flow of life itself.
So in our studying of Witold Kula's book and a few others at a later point, one of the things that was really interesting specifically about this period that's addressed in this little clip, also in early modern Europe and the time of enclosures, was the way that land was measured. And up until that moment, and for centuries before, land was measured either by labor time or by amount of grain required. So that's to say that, you know, someone might inherit a field that takes 2 days to plow. And something that's based on a labor relation necessarily takes into account the specific terrain of the field, the specific amount of effort that it would take if it was uphill and therefore, you know, more difficult to work. To some extent, and particularly the measurement by the amount of grain required would take into account the specific degree to which the land is arable, whether the soil has nutrients in it. And so measurement existed in a flexible relation between all the different aspects of how something is going to take place and be used, and how the human labor and body, together with technologies, together with the land, come together in the unit of measurement. What started changing at that moment was that land began being measured as we now know it by surface area. And it seems to us now as a really kind of common sense way of understanding land, right? It's an acre or a hectare. I don't actually know what either of these things are, to be honest, but nevertheless, a square mile, what have you. But at that moment, it felt completely alien because it didn't take account of any of the factors of what might make it more or less valuable to its user. And as we were learning in the Witold Kula, often the measurement of land and sometimes of common land would be the thing that preceded it being enclosed, or some kind of disposition happening on the basis of perhaps at the minimum a recalculation of the taxes that a given peasant owed their local feudal lord, for example, if their land was deemed to be, you know, more valuable than it in fact was, because it had a few hectares of swamp at the back that they couldn't use for anything. And we'll come back in with another clip shortly up to the issue of superstition that developed around this, and the fear of measurement that was really present in Central and Eastern Europe throughout history, but certainly at that moment. But something that was really interesting to us as well, that we began learning throughout that history, and that's also present in this, the quote that opened this clip is actually the opening quote of the Witold Kula book, but it itself is quoting this Ron, a Jewish historian, and this kind of positioning of measurement in relation to original sin. And yet, there's also, from antiquity onwards, a relationship that's drawn up between measurement and the arbitration of justice, and the way that, you know, the goddess Themis, and in the contemporary environment, I guess she's called Lady Justice, the symbol of jurisprudence is someone blindfolded with a scale, because a measurement, you know, couldn't but be fair. But on the ground, as we learned, measurement almost couldn't be but be unfair. And one of the main reasons that it could be used to cheat in lots of different situations was that there often wasn't a common standard that transcended geographical boundaries, and each small hamlet would have their own bushel and their own yardstick, and every time you traded grain, something would be skimmed off because something was a slightly different size. And as we continued to learn about this stuff, one of the most striking things in relation to the metric system that we now all use that we didn't know, maybe you knew, that the metric revolution and the French Revolution were very closely interlinked. And that prior to the French Revolution, one of the main complaints that was registered in every village across France was the instability of measurement standards. And there was something like 10,000 different measurement systems in France alone at that moment. And when the new revolutionary government came in, they, as you probably know, have changed the calendar and the amount of days of the week and the names of the months, and they're really trying to structure a new world to operate in. And so, of course, they wanted to come up with a standard measure that would work for all of France initially, so that, you know, if there was going to be equality and freedom for every citizen, that had to be a priority. But it's also quite a kind of complex, ambivalent story that maybe we don't have time to go into super deep, but they commissioned scientists in the Academy of Sciences to come up with a new measure, because they didn't want to just standardize the imperial Parisian measures. And what they came up with was to measure the size of the Earth and then use 1/10,000,000th of the distance from the pole to the equator to be the standard meter. And then the scientists went, these two astronomers went on what turned out to be a 7-year journey to try and triangulate the distance between Dunkirk and Barcelona, and from that calculate the whole, and from that calculate the meter. But the idea was that they were creating a standard for all people for all time, because what could be, you know, more equal and more unchanging than the globe? But there's a lot of,
Yeah, there's a lot to talk about in relation to that. I think what's important is that the kind of, and I think what drew us to this story initially was to think about this process of abstracting measurement from a specific body to the abstract symbol of the Earth, and doing that in what's, I mean, like, I guess one person referred to this as like one of the first instances of big science. It was an incredibly difficult expedition, and used kind of the most sophisticated tools from astronomy and geodesy of the time, and of course, the rhetoric surrounding it was very much directed at the idea of creating an egalitarian society in France, but at the same time, it was kind of at the height of the French Empire, and the act of measuring the globe and creating a standard unit from that. And of course, the meridian that was chosen runs through Paris. You know, it was of course a tremendous colonial grab in terms of determining what this kind of standard would be. Yeah, so it's this like incredibly rich history. There's a great book by Ken Adler that describes this journey, because it was really kind of crazy as well, and it was happening in the middle of the French Revolution. These scientists are constantly mistaken for aristocrats and
Prussian spies, because they're trying to climb towers with telescopes in the middle of a revolution, and they kept being arrested and injured.
Yeah, so that's So I mean, I guess this is kind of some of the background that we were coming at, and again, as always, the question was, well, what do we actually film? And our initial idea was to learn about what metrology was in the present. We understood that that we've shifted from these standard artifacts, the meter, the platinum meter that's in a basement in Sèvres, just outside of Paris, and the standard kilogram, which is also kept in that safe, and that measurement standardization is calibrated through atomic constants. In the 1980s, there was a big shift of all measurement standardization to what's called the 7 SI units. It's worth noting, we don't talk about it in the film, but it's worth noting that this shift happens roughly at the same time that the gold standard is abandoned. So this kind of the idea of shifting away from a material artifact at that particular moment in time actually has really, I think, strong significance with the history of measurement in relation to property, in relation to the production of currency, and the structures of power that are derived from that. Yeah, also we had a weird playback issue with this particular clip. It shouldn't be strobing like that. Yeah, so what we did is the very first thing we did was we approached the National Physics Laboratory in just outside of London, the NPL, and the NPL is the UK institution that is responsible for all measurement standardization. And there are many partner institutions in different countries around the world, and this is the UK representative. They, do everything from kind of redefining they map the oceans, they redefine the heat measurements.
Like they're trying to make an accurate measurement of the coldest and hottest temperature ever recorded, for example.
Yeah, they do data science, math, they have many departments. It's an enormous institution with thousands of scientists, and many different applications in industry and military, and I think quite naively we approached them, and we're like, hey, we're interested in measurement, and can we come and see what you guys are up to? And we had about kind of three months of email correspondence with them, and we submitted all kinds of material about the type of film that we wanted to make, and they finally had us come in for a meeting. And do you want to talk about the meeting?
In the meeting, it was the two of us, two scientists, and a PR person. And we'll talk about the meeting some more shortly. And perhaps, as you can see in these sequences that represent this meeting in the film, and then these are the only sequences from the NPL in the film. Ultimately, after much more paperwork and much more speaking with the PR person, we were not granted access to film there, mainly because they found that we wouldn't make them a promotional video for free. But somehow, after months of trying to make this happen, we got that email saying that we won't be able to film there. We had this incredible sense of relief on the one hand, because we wouldn't have been able to make the film about the things that are really actually important to us about this if we had to get their sign off, because in the meeting it was clear that their political position on this stuff is nothing like ours. But also we became really inspired, and somehow this issue of us not being able to get access to this kind of citadel of knowledge production, we decided to use it as the kind of main structuring device for the film. And so the film is in a number of different chapters across 3 historical periods: the early modern land enclosures, then the French Revolution, the Metric Revolution as the science and the journey, and then this meeting that we had there, which kind of opens and closes the film, and kind of thinking of how even in this contemporary situation and in all of those senses, measurement is enclosure in some way.
Well, I think there was kind of this remarkable contradiction between the rhetoric that they were using. They were very committed to the idea that the abstraction of the science of measurement from physical artifacts created the conditions for its democratization. So the idea that it's just math means that it's accessible to everyone, so that the meter that's now defined by the distance that light travels through a vacuum, which is 1 by that's accessible to everyone, and the labs were needed to create that kind of physics experiment.
As in, it's basically, it's now based on the speed of light, which is also kind of tautological because the speed of light is calculated in kilometers per second. But they were presenting us this information with this, yeah, sorry, go ahead.
I mean, so redefining every kind of measurement based on atomic constants would of course is of course a major innovation in the science of measurement, but the terms through which it's executed bear a kind of remarkable resemblance to a longer history of measurement as a tool, as a coercive tool of power, as a system for producing worlds that are mapped through a control power paradigm. And so this kind of the gap between how they were speaking about it and then us being like, oh well, okay, can we film and like no. And of course it's and in the film I think we spent a lot of time in the script kind of really working out how to tell this story, because and I guess we'll get to that in a second, but what was important, it was not to see them as the embodiment of power. These are middle management people. These are people who don't have I mean, so one of the remarkable things that comes up in the film, and I don't think we really planned to talk about it, but the scientists were really eager for us to come. The two scientists who were in the room with us, they were really excited that we were excited about it, because I think they've never met anyone who is excited about measurement standardization. So they were like, wow, and like the history of it. But they weren't responsible. They didn't have the authority to allow us to film in this institution. That was up to the PR person, and the PR person was a 27-year-old who didn't know anything about measurement, but had been hired has been outsourced as someone whose responsibility it is to create the institution's public image, and they had to assess whether it was worth their time. Like, I think probably had we been Netflix, they would have been more interested to do it, but even then they would have been extremely, extremely determined in terms of what kind of story we could tell. The story that was interesting to us, a historical arc, a relationship of measurement to different models of the world, was not, they would have never allowed us to tell that story. And so what you're seeing here is a model that we basically recreated the scene of this meeting in this office using photogrammetry tools and 3D rendering. So using instruments of measurement, instruments that are in photogrammetry, I think what's interesting is that the images that come out of it are actually a byproduct of measurement. They're not primarily image-making tools. The images are there for humans to be able to access what are otherwise just abstracted measurements. And so and I think as a visual language, photogrammetry kind of bestows something of that relationship to truth, of that relationship to like objective reality, and we wanted to kind of use those tools to tell this much stranger story, I guess.
And just very briefly
yeah.
on that. And as you will have been seeing in these kind of 3 outtakes, but in the 3 scenes where different kind of moments in this meeting are described, it goes from the camera being on the inside, kind of looking out on everyone who's present. It's like the viewer and all the people at the meeting are potentially invited in. Also, the little caveman guy there is a little joke that we open with, where in the meeting, one of the scientists was like, oh, I know what you should do in the film. You should have a little caveman dancing around and measuring things with a stick or a bone so that people can understand, how people use the body for measurement.
Which is such a telling way to, for us was such a telling kind of way that this narrative emerges of this like teleology. Well, like, oh, there was a caveman and the bone, and now we measure atoms, and that's just like in a direct line, and we've just gotten a lot more precise since then. So that's how you explain it, and the absurdity of that when we put it into the context of the film, I think really like comes through.
And then in the second sphere, the viewer is somehow already inside, but everyone is still outside, and everyone is inside. And then the final one that probably won't come up while I'm trying to finish talking, all of us are outside this kind of central node, because neither us, nor the scientist, nor the PR person has full access to the terms of this conversation or of this institution. And it's really, as Beny was saying, it's not about them keeping us out, but it's about how somehow no one there has full agency over the situation, because power is so kind of decentralized and distributed that all of them are ultimately alienated from the work that they do.
Yeah, and I think these three, so there's 3 time periods in the film, and each one of those are split into 3 sections, and they're told in a nonlinear way. And what you've seen here is 3 sections that are actually dispersed over the whole film, just because we wanted to kind of explain. I mean, and I think that's kind of, we don't make that explicit, like what you're describing right now with the different positions of the camera in relation to the people, in relation to the space. But I think we also wanted to show this as an example of how we try to turn kind of complex and abstract ideas into forms, and even if they're not explicitly explained, there's something in that movement that is a kind of consolidation of our ideas, and that's maybe a good way to talk about this as well. So, as we were saying, we were really interested in these descriptions of superstitions in early modern Eastern Europe, and in that kind of were present in folk tales and myths and stuff like that. That I guess some of them were like from Lithuania, from Poland. There were a whole list of superstitions, and one of the things that they had in common was the kind of that measurement arrested life. It arrested living processes. So, for example, there was a superstition that if you measure the cloth that you cut to make your children's shirt, the children will stop growing. Or if you measure precisely the harvest in one season, your harvest will fail in the next season. So there's this kind of idea that measurement interferes with the natural order of things. And that's just like very interesting to think about these kind of stories emerging at a time where landowners are creating new measurement systems that don't account for the labor, for the human experience in relation to the land, and are using measurement as a tool of dispossession. And so this was an image that was created as a kind of amalgamation of many of those stories that we were interested in. We don't tell them explicitly in the film, but again, that's an example of how we kind of create forms from these concerns. And yeah, I mean, this field is a cornfield outside of Nantes, France, and the figure is we scanned him in Suffolk in the UK, and this piece of corn. All of these scans were individual. So this ear of corn was in our living room, and we kind of put all these things together.
And this issue of kind of stillness and movement and measurement arresting life while time is nevertheless passing was another kind of thing we wanted to explore through, on the one hand, creating images through point cloud scans that are a static environment, but then making a cinematic movement, cinematic experience out of that. And so always keeping in tension the seemingly incompatible elements of stillness and movement through the kind of connection of these two media.
And again, I mean, photogrammetry it's a tool of measurement, so it requires that things be completely still. And what happens when things aren't still is that you get these distortions. So the technician who scanned this field mostly scans buildings for architectural models or ruins or things like that. And when our producer asked him to scan this field, he was kind of really ensconced because he thought we were kind of making fun of him or something, making fun of his tools. And then he said something like, "Oh, you're probably making the kind of film that you need to take drugs to understand," or something like that. And you see, yeah, I mean, fair enough, I guess.
He's not wrong.
But yeah, but I mean, you know, we found something really beautiful about, you know, what you're seeing here with this cornfield is you're seeing the trace of very little wind moving through the leaves that creates these very painterly impressions. And so yeah, that kind of the tension between stasis and movement is just kind of present on so many levels, I guess, in this film. And then, but also on the theme of drugs and psychedelic images.
So then the third segment that appears in a few different scenes in the film was around the story of the French Revolution and the making of the meter. And most of that was shot with a 360 camera. And there's a number of different reasons for why we went with that. On the one hand, it was because we were doing this quite confronting thing of going full, you know, period costumes, dudes in wigs, and wanting to kind of have a tension between that and something more contemporary. But on a more serious note, from a conceptual point of view, the way that a 360 camera makes an image is by creating a sphere that you can then, you know, unfold and flatten, or you can view in a virtual reality environment as a sphere. Whoops. And so relating that sphere to the globe that they were measuring, and to some extent to the fiction of the perfect sphere that they were after. But also 360 cameras, the way that they work, there's no behind the camera, right? We had to run away and hide in a bush, and the actors are walking with the camera, which was a very weird experience for our first working with actors. But the 360 camera erases itself, and it erases the kind of 0 point where the technology of observation or an observer would be. And so it somehow presents this supposedly objective and complete view onto a particular environment. And the reason that we found this to be very kind of compelling and very relevant to this particular story is that what they were trying to do, these scientists, were precisely to somehow erase objectivity and a human position from the meter, from the measurement standard, by linking it to something supposedly stable in nature, which is the distance from the pole to the equator.
I mean, I think, yeah, so again, it's a bit difficult to tell it in this abbreviated version, but what's important to I think for that is to understand how the meter was calculated, and they triangulated the distance from Dunkirk and Barcelona as a section of the meridian that they were trying to calculate from. And to do that, they were taking astronomical observations, and what that required was very carefully observing the passage of stars. And in observing that passage of stars, the time that it takes for light to enter the eye and be registered by the brain, that takes time, and that time produced micro errors on over thousands of calculations. And this wasn't known yet to science. This became later in the middle of the 19th century. This was studied in great depth, actually in response to the error. So the meter there's an error in the meter that we still use, even though now it's calculated based on the passage of light through a vacuum, it's 0.2 millimeters off. And that's because they miscalculated the distance from the pole to the equator by 2 kilometers. And that 2 kilometer error is the residue of many errors over thousands of calculations of this lag between light hitting the eye, hitting the brain. There's a great book by Jimena Canales called The 10th of a Second, and so it's this 10th of a second, which is the measurement of that time, that lag, this was studied very closely by Hermann von Helmholtz, and is also incidentally has like an interesting relation to the history of cinema, because it's kind of the study of that lag and the technologies used to quantify that lag would ultimately be the technologies that were necessary for chronophotography. So I mean, that's kind of like I guess like a side story. I don't know what happened. Yeah. I think we're kind of at time, yeah. It's battery. Okay, my battery is out. But I think that's a sign. But I think that was just necessary to explain what was so appealing about the 360 camera as something that erases itself, and then kind of and I guess.
I think with the error also in terms of erasure, the important thing to mention is that they were aware that there was an inconsistency, but they covered it up because the actual kind of ideological and practical need for a meter outweighed it being precisely 1/10,000,000th of that particular distance. But one of them, who was convinced that it was kind of his fault and his moral failing that this error existed, because they didn't yet have the scientific concept of error and uncertainty that's now, calculated directly into such calculations. One of them spent the rest of his life, which was only a few years, because on one of these expeditions he caught yellow fever and died, trying to go back and correct his observations. And the thing that he was so obsessed by is precisely trying to erase himself and his own kind of body and his own error from what should have been this eternal objective measurement.
Yeah, so I think just as a kind of the question that we had of kind of like what happened when we moved measurement standards away from the body was a kind of a series of decisions and experimental models that were developed in order to eradicate the presence of a human in the act of measuring and being in the world and producing knowledge about the world, and the implications of that. And then I guess it's kind of I guess we just wanted to consider the implications of that and what is a political structure when we've created the condition of self-erasure from the pursuit of truth or from the pursuit of knowledge about the world. What does it mean to scientifically erase the human body? I think that's probably good. Yeah. Did you want to say anything else? No? Okay. Well, thanks.
So I think we have some questions. I don't know if we have some questions in the audience to start with. Otherwise, I will start with some of my own. No?
Would it really be a question? Because I'd like more like ideas for discussion. So I don't know. Thank you. Do you hear me? I have a lot of associations with what you were saying, and try to keep it minimal. But one of the things that kept appearing is that there's like a historical movement happened to, let's say, greater abstraction, which would also be the Enlightenment thing, where the idea would be to make universal rules so as not to be prone to this historicity. As we all know, that's impossible to make, both historically if we approach it with Foucault, but also I guess with the transcendental conditions of measuring itself. But just by being able to measure and repeat, then we can learn how to fake that. And then I also see this like relation to the whole Marxist problematic of like commodity, money, commodity movement, like from use value and money is just a mediator in between, to the money, commodity, more money circulation, which always already begins in the abstract and is kind of defined by itself, like the light measuring kilometers then being used to measure the meter, but they're always, at least in a practical common sense, people do keep referring to something outside of these pure abstractions anyways, if I'm not mistaken. And I was thinking in relation to these new, especially reproductive technologies of reproduction, that like at some time, I would be like even Hitlerian here to say like it's like techno-determinist in a sense, or media determinist, that it even became possible to think in this way. But what was interesting with the Renaissance naturalist, for me, and as you presented it, is that, so again, the condition to represent, to classify something as monstrous something that should be abnormal in a normativized way already is like this inherent contradiction of the whole process, and that includes the fact that like representation, in whatever sense now we will use it, like either as a as text or as an image or as a photograph, decontextualizes and leads to easier accumulation, which will lead to these doomsday apocalyptic, a new apocalyptic experience, but that this abstraction of the monstrosity as solutions to some kind of local problems and unexpected things, by being, through this new technology, being made immediately like abstract and universal, makes monstrous actually into something very different and not fitting into the naturalist framework, whereas before maybe they would have been there, but the very fact that this guy did these things conditioned the possibility of his work being rejected. Yeah, that's why I said I don't really have a question. It was just some like associations, because it was a long talk. Yeah, so I don't know if that's something you came up with, or if you have ideas also how to deal with it in, say, today's filmmaking practice, because I mean that's a thing for me too, how to get away from this kind of realism or naturalist realism where the only real entities are those decided by the elite white man, and everything else is just interpretation or projection, which is inherent to photography, at least European photography. We know that photographs in India used to also work differently, and how to deal with that both in terms of the constitution of the image, but also like with montage or like experimenting with. I mean, it was very multimedia, so I guess it becomes apparent that each technology does something different even to the same space. So if you see maybe a shift in the possibilities of this technological development to make a world that will be beyond this kind of Enlightenment modernism of the one world reality, if we take that technology or media conditions actually what people can think and do in the first place.
Well, I mean, I think that's where like a historical approach to things is so vital, because if measurement is supposed to reduce the kind of contamination a reality with human subjectivity. If you look at the history of measurement, you see a lot of human decisions that went into doing that. And so my approach, I think our approach is always kind of, to contextualize something, historically, as a way to highlight the decisions that are part of something that is taken for granted. Measurement produces a certain type of knowledge, but it's one of many types of knowledge that exist, and it's one of many types of realities that exist. So focusing on the type of reality that is measurement, and to link it to other developments like land enclosures, like the colonial projections over the surface of the earth, is a way of foregrounding how provisional it is. I mean, I think that's something we talk about a lot, is that, our interest is in science, and in the history of science is an interest in its provisionality, as something constantly evolving.
And you're absolutely right to link the issue with standardized measurements with circulation of money and commodity in Marx, because even though the ideological pretense of developing this kind of one measure for all people for all time was that so that people can be equal, what it really achieved is the kind of enforcing the possibility of everything being equivalent and exchangeable, and just reinforcing that worldview in a way, and not just in an ideological sense, but in a kind of perceptual and processual sense of how you relate to things. Suddenly everything can be like everything else and can be exchanged, and capitalist kind of colonial expansion is greased.
Equality has there's many forms of equality, equality is often used as this kind of like single monolithic term, but there's we can all be equally able to be punished by the law. We can all be equal, we can all have equal rights to vote or equal rights to own property. Those are all different paradigms of what equality are, and they're often intersect in ways that are completely unequal. And so for that to be the only standard by which something is measured is kind of ripe with ways for that to be manipulated based on who owns the standards,
For me, this contradiction is very interesting. This contradiction of the equality of the measurement method and the inaccessibility of its own its production. It reminds me a little bit of this contradiction that Lyotard identified about the fact that yes, now truth is produced in these language games where we discuss with each other and we agree. But then you need the labs, you need all these technical means that are only available through production and through production goals, which means that reason itself will be deeply influenced by the current dominant system. So for me, it's very interesting that you do this arch, so kind of following the different political and philosophy. It's not so much in the film, but it's there at the same time. It's different political and economic and philosophical as well paradigms that change, and the tools itself have to change.
Two things. Maybe you can talk about the paradigms, but just very quickly, what you just said about the accessibility of tools. In the meeting, this really happened in like quite a comical way, where one of the scientists was giving us this really impassioned speech about how the way that they, there's no object involved somewhere, it's just math, and it's accessible to everyone, everywhere, we've achieved democracy, great. And we're like, oh great, can we make a meter then? How do you do that? And he's like, well, you'd need a perfect vacuum, a laser with high spectral stability, a carousel shutter, and an atomic clock. And we're like, okay, cool. Yeah.
Which is like, there's only
Very
like a few
democratic.
atomic clocks in the world, yeah.
And then what it was incredible is we tried to kind of unpack that with them, and he was just like, no, democracy has been achieved. No, it's not happening yet.
Yeah, it was really remarkable how powerful the rhetoric was in his mind, because it had so much to do with self-definition. His own identity was wrapped up in that rhetorical need, and so so it wasn't, yeah.
But also, I thought maybe you were gonna say that we were very explicitly conceived of those kind of three ways of measuring, loosely to say, like, from the body, from the kind of physical but already abstract notion of the globe, and then to complete abstraction, we were very explicitly thinking of them in relation to different forms of power, initially kind of just like the sovereign power, even on the kind of micro level of a local feudal lord who has absolute power over the domain, then kind of the colonial power, and then currently the amorphous power of kind of neoliberal finance, really, that no one actually even has full access to.
In a very rough diagrammatical sense, like we think of like a movement from the limb to the planet to the constitution of matter, and those as different paradigms for power structures, and the difficulty that we all have in the present of, trying to figure out where is power. It seems like there's this oppressive force everywhere, and it seems like we lack often very basic freedoms, but it's not. Where is it? Is it in this room? We came to this really average-looking conference room in this impressive but also totally opaque building on the outskirts of London. We had to do multiple security checks to get in, and so But then we were there in that room with people. It was just total. It was like so. I mean, it's in the film. We didn't mention it, I think, now, but there was this moment in the meeting where it was clear that these scientists were really enthusiastic about us coming to film, but suddenly the older guy, he was a mathematician, turns to the PR person and says, "Well, that's of course if the thought police over here allow it." And it was like we were there as guests asking for access to this place, and these three people are representatives of that place, and two of them very much want us to enter. And there's this third person, a 27-year-old, doesn't know anything about metrology, has a degree in PR, has been outsourced by the organization to represent their public image, and that person is going to decide whether we can access. Where is this? The standard weights and measures, they used to be hidden in the Acropolis in ancient Greece. They were physical things that were guarded by armed guards. The platinum meter in Sev, it's in a vault that's it's this hard thing, and it was very, very clear to everyone in each of these periods how valuable having that standard is, how contingent the structures of power are on holding on to those things. We come into this place, where is it? Is it this PR person who doesn't know what we're even talking about? Didn't speak once in an hour and a half long conversation. We're just totally bewildered about like what we were even talking about. So we kind of, that was in itself the foundation for the story. We had to kind of tell, we didn't see the very cool looking physics labs that do things, but we got a taste of what the relations around it are.
There's so many things to talk about. Would you be willing to take a question about your method and process and what happened when you were making this? So I have nothing to do with film. I don't understand it. Never made a film. But there's a question I have is, you talked a little bit about your storyboard. And I can get the importance of this meeting that you had in this building. But you asked the question, you ask yourselves, what do you actually film? So I would love to know more about when those moments happened to you. You said, I can now see whether that's what happened. I'm curious to know, did that create a part of your process? how those decisions happen. Yeah, I'd love to hear anything about that.
I mean, I'm sure you could glean that that process was very different in substance in the two films, but there is also kind of a key methodological sort of anchor for both of them. In a demonstration, as you can see, it was, well, almost all of it basically was filmed by us in a indexical way in environments that pre-exist our intervention. And our intervention was in exactly what, most importantly, how we filmed things and then how we put them together. And all of that wasn't pre-planned. It was very kind of improvisational in relation to a set of key concerns of how we translated something like the importance of the cut in the historical moment to exploring the cut cinematically, for example, and a number of other things, a visual analogy, both for shooting and for editing. And so being driven by those things and kind of exploring that way for Constant, for a number of different reasons, different subject matter, but also pandemic, and wanting to highlight what it means to not have access, the way that we approached it was altogether different. And I don't know, do you want to pick up there?
I mean, it's worth mentioning that, because we didn't see the full films here, that they also deal, each of the films deal with narrative really, really differently. With Demonstration, we didn't want it to be narrated. We didn't want an essay film, we didn't want like a voiceover narration. It was, like I think I mentioned briefly, we wanted this kind of tactile, like the real kind of gut feeling that we had when we were interacting with this material. And so the music is also a huge part of it. The sound design, actually in both of them, the sound design is is a very central way that we work with kind of creating the types of interactions that we want to bring out from the film. With, you know, I think in a way with Demonstration, there's it in the opening scene. There's text on screen that gives very minimal information about, I don't know, it's maybe like 10 lines of information that just kind of some basic things just to say what you're gonna, this kind of actually very affective experience, very non-textual, non-symbolic experience is just something for you to immerse yourselves in. And, you know, we were driven in Demonstration by creating states of abjection, states of uncertainty, states of a sense of searching. We wanted to evoke an experience for the viewer of this feeling that there was something there that needed to be decoded, because we were thinking about kind of early naturalists and this kind of this need to kind of decode these symbols that they felt had been, but just as an experience, not necessarily as a means of finding out. So some people are, you know, I think with Demonstration, some people either like get it exactly or they don't, because a certain type of viewer might be looking for something more concrete in it, and kind of maybe then misses the more experiential aspect of it. With Constant, it was very clear that there was no way for us to tell the story without voiceover narration. There was so much material that we had to cover. Metrology, despite being very, you know, a very kind of prosaic thing, of course, is not, I think, common knowledge. I don't know. I don't think that. I could be wrong. I mean, maybe everyone here knows how the meter was calculated initially, but we kind of went with the assumption that the average person actually doesn't have that information, and that in itself is interesting, and that we have to create. And it's also our responsibility to tell this story in a certain way, to tell a not obvious history of metrology, a history of metrology that's linked to enclosure. I mean, a very clearly politically motivated. It's exactly not neutral or something. It's like we have a story to tell. And so, yeah, I mean, that was really difficult. It was like a real challenge for us writing the script. And it took half a year, and we just revised endlessly. And we had amazing luck to be able to work with the voiceover narrator, Cynthia Beat, who is actually also a filmmaker. And I think she did a great job with the delivery. But that was also really like kind of difficult to figure out, like how.
But I think further with the images, our initial kind of thrust with demonstration, we were thinking of like what kind of cinematic techniques with a camera would be able to create those states that reference that particular way of looking at the world. But with and because we were looking at an alternative history of a certain scientific and technological development to some extent, our first question was, which technologies should we use to generate images? And localizing those, and then kind of from that thinking of how to use them in a way, that they're not used, that that's not their main kind of purpose, how to twist them into something else for cinematic means. And then as we were writing the script, which is, and we haven't worked in this way before, it's like a 40-minute film, and there's quite a lot of text across the different historical periods, and it's divided kind of in 9 parts, 3 segments for each period, and they're kind of interspersed in various ways. And as we were writing it, we planned a number of things and movements, either in these digital environments where you have to plot things really precisely, or with actors, it was a bit more free to generate a bunch of material and work with it. We planned a certain amount of things that we wanted to generate for each one of those 9 segments. But then when we went into the edit, we had to I think one of the things that we're really committed to methodologically is that no matter what, at every step, you can only and should only really know what you need to do at this next step. And then when the step after that comes, to be able to be open to the reality of what you've done and what you have in front of you. And sometimes it might massively surpass something that you might have premeditated, often, in fact. But, sometimes you might premeditate a particular transition that's going to be really juicy from 2 unrelated things, and it just doesn't work. And you just need to be like, doesn't work, cut it out, abandon, think of a different way to connect a structure. And at every stage, to just be present with what's actually there. And at every stage of the edit, we sat down to edit it, and we thought, the script writing horror was behind us, and we can finally do some filmmaking, and we started putting the things together, and we were like, the script doesn't work with this stuff. And so we had to pause for a couple of weeks and go and rewrite it, and that kept happening, and it was really horrible.
Yeah, I think that's so important. I think, we need to be responsive in every moment to the conditions. So I think we do this intuitively, but then the more we've worked together, the more we realize like how fundamental that is to the process. Like we arrive at the library, the prized object we came to travel for, it's not there. So what do we do with that? But the thing that compelled us to go to that place is somehow present in that space, and it's channeled through this woman's, literally like channeled through her nervous system. So how do we engage with that? How do we respond to the reality that's there? We wanted to go see labs and probably make a much more boring film when we initially set out to make the film about NPL. But we had to respond to the reality of our experience, and that kind of really happens at every moment. And ultimately, that's because we want our films to be kind of surfaces of kind of zones of reciprocity between the audience and the film. Like we invite, and of course you don't see that here so much because we're talking over it and showing you small clips. But the types of films we want to make are kind of invite the viewer to co-create. This is like a tactile, responsive surface, and we want people to engage with that. And so we think a lot about like what is the viewer experiencing. And like, as you were saying, you know, in terms of like the stuff that we actually produce, you know, we have, I don't know, hard drives full of like very, very beautiful shots and very elaborate constructions that just like get dumped, you know, like we're ruthless in the editing process because
yeah, I think, so not only in relation to these actual events that unfold unpredictably and responding to them, but also responding to what images are actually made. Because at a certain point, what happened in a room doesn't matter anymore because it's not there. It's like what you managed to film and what that communicates to someone else, because that's the only thing in the film. So it's been responsive to things as the events as they unfold, but it's also been responsive at a certain moment when you're going into editing. You kind of have to forget about all that and just be like, okay, well, this is the material, and we just need to, you know, this is the world now that we're responding to. And we feel really strongly that things that are made that where you don't set out to tell a particular thing in a particular way that you think you already know, but that there's a process of intellectual but also artistic discovery that happens in the process of the thing always makes a much stronger artwork and a much stronger experience for the viewer. And we feel that when we watch things by other people that we respond to, that you can feel that at every moment they were present in the making of it.
Any other question from the other?
I want to return to that PR guy situation because there's like two things when you're describing this issue, like where's the power and how we feel kind of powerless. Power is everywhere, but also nowhere, not just like in a Foucauldian sense, but I guess in many. It became really clear that it appears through this organizational conventions that quite apparently want to like dilute power, which would be like a nice thing. So not right. So that's like democratic. So we separate different kinds of power, but it also makes it unclear. Like it has the unintended or even intended effect of never actually being able to point to anyone or anything specifically. And even if one manages to, or a group manages to articulate in such a way, soon there will be the solution of like, again, splitting something up, putting it somewhere else, or decentralizing, like with money and like money laundering, or putting fake companies and not paying taxes. So it became, like that situation shows this like very, very well how it, like everything is built on this like diffusion of responsibility, while money and power keep accumulated.
And I mean, it's literally teleologically connected to this late 18th century Frenchman going mad because he couldn't understand why his calculations were wrong, and the reason his calculations were wrong was because of a living body that was between his brain and the stars. Like it's literally that power relationship is inscribed.
Yeah, and that relates to the other thing when the scientist was convinced of this, how democratic it is, and of course I understand that on some level it would be democratic, but I think there's not just the fact that it's really expensive to get these things, and then you have to have training, even to use it, but you would also have to use it in a correct way. Otherwise, right, we're going to be like the error from the normative position. However, I mean, for one thing, of course, that's what artists would do, or like people from other societies, or even say lower class people in Europe. It doesn't have to be like exotic, because tools are kind of like they condition, but they're also like free. You're free to use them in a different way, or like through errors arrive somewhere, which I think where it's also like where the innovative science happens, or like to be able to notice that an error is productive, which connects to thing I think that's been floating around all the time. Anyways, is this democratization of like knowledge making through the internet, and I think it already happened, at least for me, in cinema because through montage. Right, you deterritorialize the things like onto images, and that would still be the Enlightenment thing. Right, you have static things that would show the truth or the true essence of a person, but through montage, and you get cuts and time, and meaning can be created in a much freer way, which I think, I mean, I don't think that the internet works in the same way, but not like Lev Manovich, I guess, but on a certain principle like that is
that freedom becomes so problematic, right? And it's with the cut, I think people also understand how powerful cinema is as an ideological tool, and almost immediately with that is the invention of a certain set of norms through which cinematic narration happens, and that's how you learn how to make cinematic images, and it's an enclosure of the terms according to which meaning can be made. Neither of us are trained in classic cinema narration. We come, essentially as artists who are interested in, making moving images, and so we don't have the burden of those conventions, and aside from the kind of the power that cinematic narration has to manipulate the reality, to imbue reality with ideological intentions, I'm also quite interested in finding always the limits of filmic expression. This is maybe like a kind of different conversation, but like there are physiological limits in cinema. You can't show everything in cinema. There's actually a very, in the scheme of things, narrow range in terms of narration, in terms of cognition, in terms of meaning making that you can put into a cinematic image. And if you're dealing experimentally with, so these norms, these cinematic norms, come in response to charting those physiological limits and those cognitive limits. And they created those standards in the shape of those limits, and those limits have been determined by commercial interests as well, and those become very weirdly like symbiotic, and we don't know kind of what else is there. There is like a lot there, and I think that's like what we're kind of invested in. I don't think we necessarily think of ourselves as like experimental filmmakers, because there's a kind of legacy, there's a certain kind of orthodoxy to experimental filmmaking as well, and there's like a historical trajectory in experimental filmmaking. Of course, that's the world we exist in experimental film, because there's not a specific name or something. But in a lot of ways, we're interested in kind of charting those boundaries of meaning making, cognition, yeah.
And I guess a number of times in the talk and in the discussion, we said something about how, as a way of talking about how we made films about these particular things, using them as a way to generate formal and technological approaches. But you can also flip that, because it's definitely reciprocal, and think we're reaching for these types of subjects as a means to have kind of a reason and a prism through which to look for new ways of cinematic expression. And it really goes both ways somehow.
For me, what I find fascinating and see there, like also in the development of cinema, right, that the standardization came also with like frames, and like in these very material means, which on some level makes it less democratic, because those who have already access to it have more power there. However, it's also more democratic, because once you can learn to do it, so whatever you do will be shared easier than when all your measurements or all your image making is just in a local, very local technical condition. But then comes digitality. The time where we are now, where it's, as you know and see, like it's easier to combine very different types of images into like one projection, because we just have these projectors that can adapt to anything, and the binaries, the digits that compute the image make it again much freer to do other things. At the same time, it's actually much more unified on some level than it ever was. And
I think that some of the contradictions that you're pointing out are the things that give us energy, and I think we go through all kinds of pains to not collapse the contradictions, to actually inhabit in the films, inhabit the space of contradiction, inhabit the, like, contradiction creates energy, it creates movement, it creates like response, you know, because there's something in us as humans, I think, that tries to resolve contradiction, because because we want to have this illusion that we have control over things or whatever. So, but I think something that's very consistent in both the films is very deliberately maintaining the not collapsing contradictions.
Sasha and Beny, thank you so much for this presentation. I think we could continue talking, but it's getting a bit late. I think it's a wonderful way to close, and thank you for the privilege to hear you talking about your unpremiered project. It's really a huge privilege. Thank you so much. And I think it's a nice way to close the conference, to see how artists can deal with these contradictions that exist and that are part of our contemporary society in a way that doesn't have to be resolved. I think that's very interesting. Thank you so much.
Thank you, thank you.
I don't know, I'll just like...
Sorry, I would just like to make a remark. Sasha and Beny, they had an exhibition this year yet, that was never, that they were not able to visit. So they were able to produce a book out of that exhibition, and they have it here. So if you would be interested, they have it's maybe difficult to get it in Portugal and in many places, and also it has a special price. Yeah. Oh, yeah. I don't know if you want to say something about it.
No, that.
Yeah, no, that's fine. Yeah, if you're interested in getting a book.
There's an essay. It's around the first film.
Well, it's already too late, so I don't want to take much time. I just want to thank you all who stayed for so long, and thank the School of Arts and CITAR, and namely Professor Daniel, for challenging us to move forward with this first graduate conference. We hope the first of many. To us, it was really stimulating, coming from different backgrounds, just trying to, and I think, at least to me, I think that was accomplished, to find common ground, and it was really refreshing to be able to move on with an event and with so many different formats around a relevant topic, I think. And we're looking forward to attend the next graduate conference. So thank you all for being here.